The wind came down from Canada without asking permission. That was the thing about the Kansas prairie in late autumn. The cold did not creep in the way it did in other places. It did not announce itself at the edges of things and wait politely for acknowledgement. It arrived all at once, flat and vast and indifferent, rolling across land so open and so empty that there was nothing to slow it, nothing to break it, nothing to soften the edges of what it intended to do. It simply came, the way drought came, the way flood came, the way all the hard facts of that country came, without apology, without warning, without mercy. Vera Hollis had lived on the Kansas prairie for 3 years. She knew what the wind meant. She knew what November meant. And she knew standing inside her cabin on the morning of the 7th of November, 1884, pressing her palm flat against the north wall and feeling the cold move through the log like water through cloth, that she had a problem she had not yet solved. She had less than half the firewood she needed to reach spring. She had a land claim she would lose if she could not prove it up by April. She had a stove that could not burn fast enough to outrun what the walls were letting in. And she had an idea that was either the best thing she had ever thought of or the most desperate measure a woman alone had ever attempted in the history of Holt County, Kansas. She was still deciding which when the door opened without a knock. Dorothea Crane did not knock. She had never knocked on any door in the settlement because knocking implied that your entry might be refused, and Dorothea Crane had not been refused entry anywhere in Holt County in 11 years. She was the wife of Reverend Silas Crane, and that position carried weight in a community where the church was the only building with glass windows and a wood floor. What Dorothea said on Sunday afternoon was repeated at the general store by Wednesday morning. What Dorothea decided at the women's auxiliary became policy before the week was out. What Dorothea believed about the proper management of grief and property was considered by most of the settlement to be as close to received wisdom as the prairie produced. She stepped into the cabin and stopped. Vera Hollis was standing on a crate against the north wall, a wooden mallet in one hand and a peg in the other, in the process of driving that peg into the gap between two logs, roughly 5 inches below the ceiling line. Behind her on the floor, folded in a careful square, was a quilt, a very particular quilt. The one with the double wedding ring pattern in deep blue and cream, with the hand-stitched border that had taken 3 winters to complete. Vera's grandmother had made it in Ohio more than 40 years before Vera was born, and it had traveled with the family from Ohio to Indiana to Kansas in the cedar chest that now sat at the foot of the bed, and it had never in all those years and all those miles been used as anything other than a quilt. Dorothea stared at it. Then she stared at the wall where 2 pegs already sat a length of rope strung between them and another quilt already hanging. Not draped across a chair, not folded in a chest, not wrapped around a pair of shoulders against the morning chill. Hanging, like a curtain. 5 inches from the log wall, the fabric suspended in open air, swaying faintly in the draft that crept through the gaps in the chinking along the base of the timber. What in God's name, Dorothea said. She said it slowly, the way a woman says something when she has not yet determined how angry she is, when she is still in the early stage of processing what she is seeing and needs the words to buy her time. What in God's name are you doing? Vera drove the peg home. She climbed down from the crate without hurrying. She was a woman of 29 with gray-green eyes and a manner of moving that suggested she was always thinking about something slightly ahead of where she was planning the next thing while completing the current one. She picked up the grandmother's quilt from the floor and began unfolding it, shaking it out with the practiced motion of someone who had handled fabric all her life. And then she stepped back onto the crate with the quilt in her arms. Insulating, Vera said. She reached up and began hanging the second quilt from the rope, adjusting the spacing, letting the fabric fall straight. Dorothea watched the quilt settle into place. She watched the 5-inch gap of open air hold between the cloth and the cold log behind it, the pocket of space that Vera was apparently creating with some deliberate purpose. She adjusted her spectacles. She drew a breath the way a person draws a breath before they say something they have been composing for longer than they will admit. "Those are your grandmother's quilts," Dorothea said. "They are," Vera said. "You are hanging your grandmother's quilts on the wall like window dressings." "I am," Vera said. She did not look down. She kept her eyes on the rope, checking the hang of the fabric, making small adjustments to ensure the quilt fell straight and did not bunch or pull to either side. Dorothea set her basket on the table. She clasped her hands in front of her with the particular precision of a woman choosing her next words carefully, the precision of someone who believes that the correct words applied in the correct order can rearrange any situation into a better configuration. Mrs. Hollis, your grandmother made those quilts with her own hands. They belong on a bed. They belong wrapped around a living person on a cold night, not pinned to a wall like some kind of display. Vera came down from the crate. She faced Dorothea across the small room, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The fire in the stove was burning low. The wind pressed against the north wall. You could hear it pressing a low and constant sound like something patient waiting to be let in, something that had all the time in the world and knew it. My grandmother Vera said would rather see me alive than see her quilts folded in a drawer. She picked up the mallet again. If you have come to help, I have more pegs to drive. If you have come to tell me how to grieve, I do not have the time. Dorothea did not help with the pegs. She sat down at the table instead, upright in the way she always sat, spine away from the chair back, and she watched Vera work. And while she watched, she began to talk about the women's auxiliary, about the winter coming, about the concern that had been expressed by several members of good standing and considerable experience about a young widow living alone in a half-finished cabin on the far edge of the claim with barely enough wood to last until Christmas. About what a woman alone could and could not be expected to manage in a Kansas winter. About the widower in Dodge City that Reverend Crane had been in correspondence with a man of sound character and solid finances who had expressed genuine interest in the possibility of a second marriage. Vera drove pegs and said nothing. Dorothea leaned forward slightly in the chair. You would not have to leave your land, she said. A husband could help you prove up the claim. A husband could cut the wood that needs cutting. A husband could. I do not need a husband, Vera said. I need firewood. Dorothea looked at the quilts on the wall, at the strange foreign sight of them hanging 5 inches from the logs, going nowhere, doing nothing that she could understand. And she said with a gentleness that was sharp at the edges, the gentleness of someone who has decided they are performing an act of mercy. Those quilts are not going to keep you warm, Mrs. Hollis. A fire keeps you warm. Wood keeps you warm. A man who can cut it before winter arrives keeps you warm. What you are doing is decorating a room that is going to be very cold in January. She stood. She took her basket from the table. I will pray for you to have the wisdom to accept help when it is offered, she said. The door is behind you if you change your mind. The door closed behind her. The latch settled into place with a small, definitive sound. The fire in the stove made a quiet shift, wood settling against the grate, and then the room was still again. Vera stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at what she had accomplished so far. 2 quilts on the north wall, 2 more still on the floor. The light coming through the south window was thin and gray, the kind of November light that gave you just enough to see by and withheld everything else light that did not commit to anything. She thought about what Dorothea had said, then she picked up the mallet and went back to work. She had buried Edmund Hollis on a Thursday in September 7 weeks before. The grave was on a low rise east of the cabin under a cottonwood that had managed against all probability to grow to a considerable size in that otherwise treeless country. Edmund had liked that tree. He had stood under it on summer evenings, looking out over the claim, over the grass that ran to the horizon in every direction, without interruption, and he had seemed in those moments to be satisfied in a way that did not require words. He was a quiet man. He had been quiet from the first time Vera met him in the dry goods store in Lawrence, where she worked the counter for 2 years before she turned 25, and she had not understood for some time that his silence was not distance, but attention. Edmund Hollis listened to everything. He simply did not speak until he had something worth saying. He had grown up on a farm in southern Ohio, the third son of a carpenter, who believed with the conviction of a man who had built things with his hands for 40 years in the practical value of every kind of knowledge. His father had taught him to read a field the way some men read a ledger, looking for information in the way the grass lay, and the way the water moved, and the way the soil changed color at the edge of a slope, where drainage altered the composition. He had taught him to build with economy, to waste nothing, to solve problems with what was at hand, before spending money on what was not. Edmund had carried that habit of thinking into everything he did. Their cabin was not large, but it was tightly joined, the corner square, the lintels level, the foundation stones set deep enough to resist the frost heave that destroyed shallow foundations in their second winter. He had been proud of it in a way he would never have said aloud. He had been cutting wood on the 2nd of September when the axe handle caught the edge of a knot in the round and deflected. The blade skipped off the wood and opened a gash across his right palm, deep and ragged, the kind of wound that bled freely and looked worse than it was. Vera had cleaned it carefully and bound it with clean linen. Edmund had said it was nothing to worry about. He had continued working. He was not a man who stopped working for something as manageable as a cut hand when the woodpile needed to be full before the first frost. By the 5th of September, the hand was red to the wrist. By the 8th, it had gone black at the palm. The fever came on the night of the 9th, and it did not leave. 3 days of it. 3 days of Vera at the bedside with cold water, and every remedy she knew, the old remedies and the practical ones, and prayer at intervals, and at the end of the 3rd day on a Saturday morning, with the sky turning the particular shade of pale gold that preceded the first hard frost of autumn, Edmund Hollis died in the bed he had built himself, from cottonwood planks and hand-forged nails in the first spring of the claim. He was 34 years old. Vera was 29. She stood at his grave under the cottonwood and said the words that were expected of her, and she thanked the neighbors who had come, and she accepted the food they brought, and she answered the questions they asked with the brevity of a woman who has not yet found the bottom of the thing she is standing over. When they were all gone, she went back into the cabin and sat down in the chair nearest the stove and tried to understand what her situation required of her. The woodpile was half what it needed to be for a full Kansas winter. Edmund had been cutting when he was hurt. There had not been time to finish before the accident, and after the accident there had been no time for anything except the vigil at his side, and then the burial, and then the long and necessary grief that did not stop the world from continuing to require things. The land claim required continuous habitation and active improvement through the following April, at which point she could file for final proof, and the land would become hers outright, a deed in her name, property she had earned by living on it. Leave before April, and the claim was forfeit. Abandon the cabin for even a sustained period, and it could be challenged by neighbors with an interest in the outcome. The nearest neighbor with a woodlot to spare was 3 miles north, and he had a family of 7 children to keep warm through the same winter with the same inadequate supply. She had no money to buy wood, not enough to make a meaningful difference. She had one stove, which she understood well, which burned hot and fast when fed generously and went cold within 2 hours when it was not. And she had a cabin that Edmund had built carefully and with great skill, but whose chinking had cracked in the long, dry heat of summer, leaving gaps in the north and west walls that let the wind in at the floor level and at the ceiling and in half a dozen places in between where the mud had shrunk away from the log. She turned these facts over in her mind one by one, looking at each from different angles, looking for something she had missed, some approach she had not yet considered. There was no obvious solution. There was no solution that did not involve help she did not have or money she could not spend. There was only the winter coming and the woodpile that would not outlast it, and the cold that moved through the log walls as if the logs were not there. For 1 week, she sat with the problem and let it be a problem without trying to fix it, because she knew from experience that the first solutions that came to her in a state of fear would be wrong. Edmund had taught her this by example rather than instruction, in the slow way that people teach each other things when they live closely together over time. He had said it about carpentry, about the way a joint that seemed to fit perfectly when you first cut it would reveal its gaps when you held it up to the proper light. He had said, do not trust the first fit. Look at it twice. Look at it in different light. What seems right in the moment is sometimes only convenient. She looked at the problem in different light. And in the second week of October, standing at the north wall in the early morning with her palm flat against the log, feeling the cold moving through it with a steadiness that no fire she could sustain would be sufficient to oppose, she began to see it differently. The general store in Taller Creek was a single room with a potbelly stove in the center and shelves that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. It smelled of coal oil and flour and the particular dry smell of things that have been kept on shelves a long time without quite being purchased, the smell of inventory that accumulates rather than turns. Vera went there on a Tuesday in mid-October for lamp oil and thread and found the store nearly empty in the slow hour after the morning rush and before the midday traffic from the surrounding claims. Nearly empty, not quite. In the far corner on the stool that sat beside the nail bins was a woman Vera had seen perhaps a dozen times in 3 years of living in the settlement, always at a distance, always alone, always moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned that she is not welcome to linger. She was old in a way that was difficult to quantify, precisely the kind of old where the years had compressed without diminishing so that she seemed smaller than her actual presence. Her hair was silver white braided and pinned with a precision that spoke of long habit and continued care. Her hands folded in her lap were the hands of someone who had worked with them every day of her life and had made their peace with what that work had done to them. Her eyes, which she raised when Vera came through the door, were a pale and steady gray alert, in the way that the eyes of people who are often overlooked learn to be alert, watching for information in the margins of situations that other people read only through the center. Her name was Ingrid Sorensen. She had come to Kansas from Uppsala, Sweden in 1862, 22 years prior, following her husband to a land claim that had not outlasted its first Kansas winter. She had stayed after his death alone on a claim east of the creek, farming what she could manage and doing without what she could not. She spoke English with an accent that had softened over 2 decades, but had not disappeared, and most people in the settlement found it effortful to follow, which was one of several reasons most people in the settlement did not much bother. Vera did not have the luxury of preferences at that particular moment. She needed information, and she needed it from someone who had survived a great many Kansas winters, and there was exactly one such person available and present and sitting on the stool beside the nail bins. She sat down on the empty crate beside her. Ingrid looked at her for a long moment, taking her measure in the way of someone who has learned to assess quickly and does not waste the assessment. Then she nodded once, the small definitive nod of a woman confirming something she had already suspected. "You are the Hollis widow," she said. "I am," Vera said. "I heard about your husband." A bad way to go. It was. They sat for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have both had extensive practice with loss and do not feel the need to perform anything around it. The silence of people who have sat through the real thing and have no patience for approximations of grief. Vera told her the situation plainly. The woodpile, the walls, the winter, the claim that required her presence through April and would not wait for her to solve the problem she was describing. She laid it out the way Edmund would have laid out a carpentry problem, in its exact dimensions, with the relevant measurements and the honest accounting of what was available without dramatization in either direction. Ingrid listened to all of it without interruption. When Vera finished, she sat for another moment with her hands still in her lap, looking at the middle distance with those pale, steady eyes. Then she said, "You have heard of dead air." Vera had not. Ingrid nodded again, as if she had expected this answer. "What you must understand," she said, "is that there are two kinds of air. Air that moves and air that does not. Air that moves is your enemy in winter. It comes through the gaps in your walls, and it picks up your warmth and carries it away into the cold outside. You cannot generate heat fast enough to replace what moving air takes. But air that cannot move," she paused. She seemed to be assembling the next thought in a language that was not her first finding the right containers for what she wanted to say. "Air that is trapped in a space and has nowhere to travel. That air does not carry heat away from you. It does not conduct the cold toward you. It simply holds. It sits in the space where you put it, and it holds whatever condition it finds itself in." Vera leaned forward slightly on the crate. "In Sweden," Ingrid said, "my family hung wool blankets on the interior walls of our home every winter. Not flat against the walls, not touching them. We held them out from the surface with wooden pegs kept a space of several inches between the fabric and the stone. And in that space the air became still. It could not circulate. It had nowhere to go. Cold air from the wall would strike that still air and find that it could not cross it. Warmth in the room would stay in the room because the still air between the wall and the fabric was holding a boundary that moving air cannot hold." She looked at Vera directly. "The cold does not pass through still air. It cannot. Still air has no mechanism for carrying it. Moving air is the vehicle, not air itself. Stop the air from moving and you stop the cold from spreading across the room. Your cabin walls are cold because the outside is cold. But put something 5 inches from those walls, and the air trapped in that space will do what no fire you can afford will do for you." Vera sat with this. She thought about this north wall, the way she could stand in the middle of the room on a cold morning and feel the cold radiating off it. She thought about what it would mean to interrupt that process, not by heating the air, but by stopping it from moving, by placing something in its path that it could not cross without moving air as its vehicle. It seemed too simple. It also seemed exactly like the kind of solution Edmund would have written down in his notebook and underlined. "Where do you hang them?" Vera asked. "The north wall first," Ingrid said. "The wind comes from the north. That is where you lose the most heat. Then the east, then the west. The south wall you keep open near the window or you lose your light." She paused. "Light matters in a long winter. Do not sacrifice it. Use a panel on the south wall that can be tied back during the day and released at night. And at the door, Vera said. At the door you need two barriers, not one, Ingrid said. One at the door itself sealed at the edges with fabric so no cold gets around it. One some feet inside making a small enclosed passage between the outer door and the main room. Any cold air that enters when you open the door fills that passage and stops there. It cannot reach your living space. Like an airlock, Vera said. Ingrid looked at her with genuine surprise. Yes, she said, exactly like an airlock. That is precisely the word. She folded her hands again. Outside the store window, the sky was the color of pewter, the clouds moving fast and low, the kind of sky that means business. You will need your heaviest quilts for the north wall, Ingrid said. The thickness of the batting matters. The more material in the fabric, the more still air is trapped inside the batting itself in addition to the space behind it. You get 2 layers of insulation instead of 1. 2 barriers the cold must cross before it reaches you. Vera looked at her own hands for a moment. She thought about the quilts in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, the ones her grandmother had made, the ones her mother had wrapped carefully in paper and placed in the wagon bed the morning they left Lawrence, saying that a home needed more quilts than a person thought it would need. The ones she and Edmund had purchased in Wichita from a dry goods merchant on the main street because Edmund had agreed with this philosophy and acted on it while they had money to spend. They were not decorations. They had never been decorations. They were, it turned out, the precise tool she needed for a problem she had not known how to name until 10 minutes ago. I have quilts, Vera said. Then you have what you need, Ingrid said. She stood from the stool with the deliberate movement of someone whose joints required forethought before action. She was not fragile in any way that mattered. She was careful the way very old trees are careful bending with the wind, rather than resisting it, having learned over decades of exposure that resistance and survival are not the same thing. 5 inches from the wall, she said. Not 4, not 6. 5. Check it with a piece of doweling cut to that measurement. If the fabric touches the logs, it becomes a conductor, not an insulator. It will carry the cold directly into your room, and you will be worse off than if you had not hung anything. The distance is everything. Without the distance, you have colored wood, nothing more. She picked up her basket from the floor. The cold is not your enemy, Mrs. Hollis, she said. It is only a fact. You do not fight facts. You understand them, and then you work with what you understand. She walked to the door of the general store and left without ceremony, the bell above the door ringing once, and then going quiet in the still air. Vera sat for a long time on the crate beside the nail bins. Then she bought her lamp oil and her thread, and walked home through the gray October afternoon, looking at her cabin with a different set of eyes than she had brought to it that morning. She went home and sat in Edmund's chair by the stove, and took his notebook from the shelf above the fireplace where she had placed it in the first days after the funeral, and had not opened since. It was a small bookcloth covered in dark blue, the kind sold at any stationer in any town with a general store. He had used it for measurements and calculations related to the cabin, for materials lists, for rough drawings of joinery connections. She had read through it once in the first week after his death, looking for some practical information about the land claim boundaries, and she had found what she needed and closed it and put it back. Now she opened it at the beginning and read it through from the first page. Most of it was what she expected and remembered. Dimensions of the foundation logs, calculations for the roof pitch and the board footage required, a list of hardware purchased in Taller Creek in the spring of 1882, with the price of each item noted beside it, sketches of joinery, small and precise in Edmund's careful hand, annotated with measurements in fractions of an inch. And then near the back, a section that was different in character from everything that had come before. A series of observations written in the same careful hand, but in a different register, less technical, more tentative, the tone of a man thinking through a problem he had not yet solved. She read them slowly. The first entry was dated March of the previous year. Stove working hard these cold mornings. North wall losing more heat than I can account for from the gap in the chinking alone. Must be something else happening. The cold seems to come through the log itself, not only through the gaps. The second entry was dated April. Same problem on the west wall after 3 cold nights in a row. The walls conduct the cold into the room. No amount of fire fully corrects this if the walls themselves are the source. Need to think on this. The third entry was undated, written in a slightly different quality of pencil pressure, as if it had been written at a different time, returned to after a pause. East corner stays warm. Why? The tipping cabinet in the northeast corner, the one with the warped leg that sits an inch away from the wall, it is always warmer in that corner. No draft near it, no extra heat source. Why would a corner hold warmth differently from the rest of the room? He had underlined the question. She sat in the chair and held the notebook in both hands and looked at those words for a very long time. She had noticed the same thing herself without recognizing that she had noticed it. The northeast corner of the cabin where Edmund had put the old cabinet with the warped leg that he had never quite gotten around to fixing the cabinet that sat slightly away from the wall because of the warp not flush against it, a gap of approximately 1 inch between the back of the cabinet and the log behind it. It was always the warmest corner in the room. She had filed this away as one of the small unexplained facts of a house, the kind of minor mystery you accept without investigating because you have other things to attend to. A peculiarity, a comfort without a cause. Edmund had not accepted it that way. He had noticed it, and he had asked why, and he had written the question down and underlined it, and then September had come, and the accident had come, and the answer had not. She stood from the chair and walked to the northeast corner. She put her hand behind the cabinet into the gap between the cabinet's back and the log wall. 1 inch of space. 1 inch of trapped air that could not circulate because the cabinet on one side and the wall on the other gave it nowhere to go. 1 inch. And the corner was the warmest in the room. She stood there for a moment with her hand in the narrow gap, and she understood that Ingrid Sorensen had not taught her a foreign trick or a Scandinavian novelty. She had given her the name for something that was already happening inside this cabin, something Edmund had observed and questioned and written down. The principal had been working here for months in 1 inch of space behind a warped cabinet, producing a warmth that neither of them had understood. Edmund had seen the evidence and asked the right question. He had just needed someone to give him the vocabulary for the answer. She took her hand from the gap. She looked at the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and she began in her mind to sort the quilts by weight and batting thickness, assigning each one to a wall. The heaviest ones for the north wall. That was where Edmund's question had started. That was where the answer would go first. She opened the chest and began lifting the quilts out one by one, feeling the batting, judging the weight, setting each one in a pile according to the wall it was meant for. Then she went to find the wooden pegs. She began on a Monday morning. She had spent the Sunday in preparation gathering what she needed and laying it out in order pegs carved from scrap lumber lengths of rope strips of old wool blanket she intended to pack into the doorframe as a gasket, a piece of dowling rod cut to exactly 5 inches that she would use to verify the spacing at every point. She had done the planning the way Edmund would have done it in her head first, and then sketched roughly on the back of an envelope, working out the sequence so that she always had access to the next section of wall so that no piece of work blocked the next piece. She drove the first peg into the north wall at 7 in the morning when the light was still thin and the stove had been going for an hour. She drove it into the gap between the logs, one peg near the ceiling, one lower, a rope strung between them, and from the rope the quilt would hang. She cut the dowling check and held it behind the rope to verify the distance from the wall. 5 inches. She adjusted until it was right. Then she moved to the next pair of pegs. By noon, the north wall was finished. The 3 heaviest quilts hung from the rope in a continuous line, 5 inches from the log, their edges overlapping by 3 inches, so there was no gap between them, no seam through which the cold that pressed against the north wall could find a passage. The grandmother's double wedding ring quilt was in the center, flanked by the 2 Ohio Star quilts her mother had wrapped in brown paper and placed in the wagon bed the last morning in Lawrence, with the instruction that a home needed more quilts than a person expected. They hung straight and still. Behind them, the air could not move. She worked through the afternoon on the east wall, the lighter quilts, and by the time the light failed, she had the east wall done and a start on the west. She ate bread and hard cheese sitting on the floor because every chair was covered in fabric and tools, and she drank water that had been warm in the pot all afternoon and was now merely cool. She looked at what she had done by the lamp's light and tried to determine how strange it looked. It looked very strange. The cabin had been a rough and simple room. 4 log walls, a plank floor, a stove, a bed, a table, 2 chairs. The accumulation of objects that 2 people gather when they intend to stay in a place. Now it looked like the storage room of a church that had run out of proper places to put things, or perhaps the inside of a very particular kind of madness. Fabric everywhere. Color from floor to ceiling. The quilts hung still and bright, and she thought exactly as purposeful as they needed to be. Dorothea Crane would say something about it. Dorothea Crane had already said something about it, and the work was only half finished. Vera gathered the remnants of her meal and cleared a space on the floor to sleep, because the bed was covered in quilts, not yet hung, and she was too tired to move them. She lay down with her coat on, looking up at the north wall in the near dark. The quilts hung still. Behind them, the air did not move. She closed her eyes and let herself believe for the first time since September that she might get through what was coming. She finished on a Tuesday. 2 full days of work in the November cold, measured in increments of endurance. She finished the west wall in the morning, 3 more quilts hung with the same 5-inch spacing, the same overlap at the edges, the doweling rod confirming the gap at every checkpoint. The south wall she handled differently as Ingrid had instructed. 1 quilt hung on rings rather than rope so that it could be drawn aside during the short hours when the winter sun came low and direct through the single south-facing window. She saved the door for last. Edmund had said the door was where a house told the truth about itself. A well-built door, properly hung, properly sealed, was the difference between a structure and a shelter. Their door was well built, the planks fitted tight and the hinges set square and true. But the frame had gaps where the wood had dried and pulled back from the logs through the summer small gaps that were invisible until you held a candle near them on a windy night and watched the flame lean away from the draft. She packed the gaps with strips of old wool blanket, pressing the fiber in with a thin-bladed knife until the space was filled completely. Then she lit a candle and held it near the sealed edges. The flame stood straight. Then she hung the inside curtain. Not a decoration, not a second door. A third surface hung 3 feet inside the main entrance, creating a small enclosed passage between the outer door and the living space. Any cold air that entered when the door opened would fill that passage and stop there, held by the interior curtain, unable to reach the main room. When she passed through the outer door, she would step through the passage and through the curtain, and the cold would not follow. She hung the curtain from a rod set across the ceiling beams. She stepped back and looked at what she had built. The cabin was unrecognizable from the inside. Every wall was fabric. The entrance was doubled. The floor drafts at the base of the north and west walls were blocked with rolled canvas weighted with stones. The stove sat unchanged in the center of the room, black iron and practical, the one thing that looked exactly as it had before. Everything else was different. She had used every quilt she owned, the ones her grandmother made in Ohio, the ones her mother sent with her from Lawrence, the ones she and Edmund purchased in Wichita because Edmund believed in having enough of things you needed, even when enough cost more than approximate. All of them were on the walls now. All of them were working. Or would be if the old woman on the stool in the general store had told her the truth. She built the fire up to a moderate level, not high the way you build a fire you intend to last through the night, and she went to bed. She did not expect to sleep well. She had not slept well since September. Sleep since September had been a shallow and interrupted series of short intervals between long periods of lying in the dark, listening to the stove contract as it cooled, listening to the wind, listening to the specific quiet of a house with only one person breathing in it. She had become accustomed to waking in the small hours with the cold already settled back into the room, the fire burned down to almost nothing needing to be fed before it went out entirely. She had come to accept this as the tax the winter levied and paid it every night without complaint. She woke on the first morning after she finished the work to a room that was not cold. She lay still for a moment, not understanding what she was experiencing. The light at the south window was the pale gray of very early morning before full dawn. She was warm, not merely less cold than she had expected, genuinely straightforwardly warm, the warmth of a room that had held its heat through the night without being fed additional fuel. She sat up. She crossed to the stove and opened the firebox door. Coals, not ash, not the gray dust of a fire that had gone completely out in the small hours and left the room to the cold. Coals, orange and deep alive, breathing slowly in the dark interior of the iron box. The fire not dead, but only resting, reduced to its essential self by hours of stillness, ready with a small addition of wood to build again into something useful. This had not happened since Edmund was alive. In every morning since his death, she had come to a cold stove and a colder room and had spent the first half hour of each day building the fire back from nothing. She had accepted it as the condition of winter alone, the daily cost of being the only one to tend the fire through the long nights. The stove had kept its coals through the entire night. She stood in front of the open firebox with her hand near the heat and she understood what this meant in terms that were immediate and concrete, the kind of understanding that comes from arithmetic rather than feeling. Less wood to restart each morning. Less wood lost to the work of bringing a cold room back to a livable temperature. Less wood consumed by the gap between where the room was when she woke and where it needed to be to sustain a human being through a Kansas winter. The quilts had held the warmth in while she slept. The still air behind them had done what the fire alone could not sustain. She stood there holding this understanding for longer than the stove required. Then she sat down on the floor next to it with her back against the warm ironside, and she cried. Not the weeping of grief, not the kind she had done in September and October, in the hours after dark, when the work of managing the day was finished, and there was nothing left to occupy the place where Edmund had been. This was something else. The release of a particular kind of tension that had been accumulating since the morning she understood she would have to spend the winter alone and had not known how. Since the night she had sat in his chair and read his notebook and found the question underlined and understood that the answer had been sitting a few miles away on a stool in a general store patient, as still air waiting for someone to sit down beside it and listen. It worked. That was the whole of it. Months of calculation and fear and the quiet, relentless weight of not knowing, and the answer was simply, it worked. She dried her face with the back of her hand. She added 2 small pieces of wood to the coals, modest pieces because the room did not need the fire to work as hard today as it had been working every day before this. She put the kettle on. She sat in Edmund's chair and opened his notebook to the page with the underlined question, and she held it in her hands. East corner stays warm, why? She thought about what she would say to him if saying things to the dead were a practice she could believe in. She thought about the words she would choose, the particular words that would mean the most to a man who had noticed a warm corner and written the question down. Because the air stops Edmund. Because air that cannot move cannot carry the cold to you. Because you put that cabinet 1 inch from the wall and the wrong placement was the right idea and you almost knew it. You were so close. She drank her tea. Outside, the Kansas sky was doing what it did in November, which was nothing in particular, gray and uncommitted, giving nothing away. The light through the south window was the light of a morning that had not decided yet what kind of day it intended to be. It did not matter. She was going to get through the winter. She was certain of it now for the first time since September, with the certainty that comes not from hope or determination, but from evidence from the simple fact of coals in a stove that had no business still burning from a room that was warmer than it had any right to be on a November morning in Kansas with half a woodpile and no man to cut more. She set the notebook back on the shelf. She looked at the north wall at the grandmother's quilt with the double wedding ring in deep blue and cream hanging still and straight on its rope. 5 inches of air. That was all it had taken. 5 inches of nothing doing everything. December came without announcement, the way December always came to the Kansas prairie, not arriving so much as settling the cold, deepening by degrees, until one morning you woke and understood that the season had committed to itself. By the first week of December, the story had traveled through every corner of the settlement. The Hollis widow had lost her mind to grief. She had covered the inside of her cabin with quilts, wall to wall, floor to ceiling, like a woman who had given up entirely on the conventions of rational housekeeping. The cabin looked ordinary enough from the outside, but from the inside it apparently resembled a fabric merchant's back room after a disagreement with the inventory. Everyone who had heard about it agreed that it was a tragedy. A young woman of good character, a sound land claim, a solidly built cabin, and grief had done what the prairie winters and the isolation and the hard work had not managed to accomplish. It had undone her. Dorothea Crane did not start this version of events. She simply repeated to anyone who inquired, and to several people who had not quite inquired but had expressed a general interest, what she had personally observed on the morning she visited and found Vera driving pegs into the north wall. She reported it with the measured concern of a woman who had witnessed troubling things before and knew how to discuss them without the vulgarity of exaggeration. She mentioned the grandmother's quilts. She mentioned the strangeness of the hanging fabric. She mentioned her own sincere effort to suggest a practical and socially acceptable path forward and the widow's refusal to consider it. She did not say that Vera was failing. She said that she feared for her. The distinction mattered enormously to Dorothea. She was not a cruel woman. She was not a malicious one. She was a woman who had built her understanding of the world on a set of propositions that had served her reliably for 53 years, And one of those propositions was that widows on the Kansas prairie in winter required practical assistance that only a functioning community and ideally a functioning husband could adequately provide. Another was that grief, when it was not channeled properly toward recovery and remarriage, expressed itself in increasingly eccentric behavior that could endanger not only the grieving person, but the community's sense of what was normal and therefore possible. She held both propositions with the complete sincerity of someone who has never been given strong reason to examine them. December came. January followed. Vera did not freeze. She burned wood at a rate that was, when she calculated it one morning against Edmund's records from the previous winter, approximately 40% of what the cabin had consumed in the same period before. She confirmed this, carefully checking Edmund's figures against her own records, accounting for variations in temperature, recalculating twice to make sure she had not made an arithmetic error. 40%. She was burning less than half the wood she had burned when Edmund was alive, and the stove had been fed around the clock by two people taking turns through the night. The stove burned low most days. Not cold, not banked entirely, but modest and sufficient. The way a fire burns when it is not being asked to carry the full weight of survival, when the walls are holding their end of the arrangement. She fed it twice a day instead of 4 or 5 times. The coals held through the night, 3 mornings and 4. She slept in her normal layers instead of everything she owned piled on top of her and still waking cold. She maintained her records in a new notebook she had purchased in October, cloth-covered like Edmund's, filled every evening with the day's observations. The temperature, the fire, the wood consumed, the condition of the quilts, anything that seemed worth knowing. She was making the knowledge permanent. She was writing the answer down so that it would not have to be found again from the beginning by whoever needed it next. The settlement watched and waited for her to fail. She did not fail. December passed. January deepened and thinned and passed. The woodpile stood at levels that should not have been possible, given what she had started with, and the knowledge of those levels spread through the settlement, the way all knowledge spread through it, imperfectly, with accretion of detail in some places and loss of it in others, but spreading. Dorothea Crane did not recant her concern. She did not update her prediction. She continued through the end of December and into January to express her worry for the Hollis widow in the measured tones she had established for the purpose. She was consistent in this. It was one of her considerable strengths. The trouble arrived in the form of the Morrison family, and it arrived in late December when the weather had committed fully to the season's worst intentions. The Morrisons were a young couple barely older than Vera, with 3 children under the age of 8, in a claim 2 miles southeast. The husband, Gareth Morrison, was a broad man who had come to Kansas with the conviction that physical strength was the main requirement of prairie farming, and had spent 3 years discovering the additional requirements one by one. His wife, Ruth, had the particular kind of energy that comes from being responsible for more things than any reasonable person should be responsible for simultaneously, and she had channeled it into a manner that was brisk without being unkind and decisive without being reckless. Vera had always respected her in the way you respect someone you observe from a distance, doing difficult things with evident competence. Ruth Morrison had heard the stories about the quilted walls. She had listened to the versions that came through the settlement's informal channels, the post-church gatherings, and the well conversations, and the general store exchanges, and she had drawn her own conclusions from them. And at some point in the early days of December, without asking Vera anything directly, she had gone home and tried to implement what she thought she understood. She hung curtains against the north wall of their cabin, flat against it. No pegs, no rope to create a gap, no doweling check for a precise spacing measurement. The curtains hung in the ordinary way that curtains hang in ordinary rooms, fabric pressed directly against the surface behind it, the way curtains have been hung in houses since people started hanging curtains. It was an entirely reasonable mistake given the information available to her. If you had heard the story as it circulated through the settlement, the critical detail, 5 inches of gap, precisely 5. The gap is not a preference, but the mechanism. Without the gap, you have not insulation but only decoration, might not have survived its journey through several retellings intact. What survived was the image. The Hollis widow hung fabric on her walls, and the cabin stayed warm. The why of it, the physics of it, the specific and non-negotiable measurement that made the why work, these were the parts that got lost. The curtains touched the logs. The logs were cold. The curtains conducted that cold directly into their surface and held it there. And in addition to conducting the cold inward, they trapped moisture between themselves and the log. The small amounts of condensation that form where warm interior air meets a cold exterior surface, and the curtains pressed into this moisture, through the cold nights began developing a mustiness within 2 weeks of being hung. The youngest Morrison child had lungs that were not robust, had not been robust since her first winter, and the combination of a damp wall and a still cold room, for the room was no warmer than before the curtains went up, was a combination that settled into her chest and produced a cough that worried everyone in the family. Ruth Morrison did not connect her curtain experiment to her daughter's cough. She was not aware that there was a connection to make. She attributed the child's illness to the general harshness of winter, which was where she usually placed the blame for things that went wrong between November and March, because it was accurate as a general proposition even when it missed the specific cause. Dorothea Crane made the connection publicly. She made it on a Sunday afternoon in late December in the gathering outside the church after the service, in the hearing of a dozen or more people whose attention she had learned over 11 years how to acquire and hold. She did it carefully, without apparent heat, in the voice she used when performing reluctant honesty, the voice of a woman who would prefer not to say what she is about to say, but who has concluded that the community's welfare requires it. She said that she had heard Ruth Morrison had attempted the Hollis method, the quilt-on-the-wall method, in her cabin. She said that she had also heard with considerable sadness that the youngest Morrison child had not been well since. She said that she did not wish to cast blame. She only felt that people deserved accurate information when they were considering drastic or unconventional measures for their homes and families. She said this and let it settle. Vera was not there to hear it. She heard about it from the merchant's wife 2 days later, told to her in the slightly embarrassed manner of someone delivering news they would have preferred to keep. Vera stood in the store for a moment with this information and let it be what it was. Then she went to the Morrison cabin. She did not go with an explanation prepared or a defense organized. She went the way you go to fix a problem, which is directly and with attention available for what you find when you get there. Ruth answered the door and looked at her with the wary expression of a woman who did not know what version of events had preceded this visitor. Vera said, "I heard your daughter is unwell. I heard you tried hanging something on your north wall. May I come in and look at what you did?" Ruth stepped aside. Vera walked directly to the north wall. She looked at the curtains hanging there flush against the log, and she understood immediately what had happened and why. She pulled the curtain back from the wall and showed Ruth the condensation line on the log surface, where the fabric had been in continuous contact. She explained what the difference was between what Ruth had done and what needed to be done without condescension and without the particular edge that the situation might have licensed her to use. She said the number 5 several times, and she said the word inches several times, and she said 5 inches together as a unit several more times, because it was apparent that this specific information had not made it through the settlement's version of the story intact, and because the information was not decorative but structural, and the structure depended on its precision. She told Ruth she would need pegs and rope. Gareth Morrison had both. Within 3 hours, the curtains were rehung correctly, 5 inches from the log. The fabric hanging straight, the pocket of still air restored to the place where it could do something useful. Vera checked the main door frame and found 2 gaps that had not been addressed. She sealed them with strips cut from a flour sack. She found a cold draft at the base of the north wall and showed Gareth where and how to block it. She did not hurry. She did not perform efficiency. She moved through the cabin the way she had moved through her own, steadily and with attention, because the method required attention and not speed, and because getting it right the first time was the point. The Morrison child's cough began improving within the week. Vera stopped at the Morrison claim on her way back from town the following Tuesday. She knocked. Ruth answered. The child was audible in the background, still coughing, but less the rattling quality, beginning to clear in the way that chests clear when the source of irritation is removed. Ruth looked at her for a moment in the doorway. She said, "I should have asked you directly." "I'm sorry I didn't." Vera said, "Next time ask." She meant it without any edge at all. She walked home in the January wind with her coat buttoned and thought about how much had depended on a single number. 5. One number, one measurement, 1 inch of precision that separated insulation from its opposite. The difference between the outcomes was not genius and not mystery. It was information exactly held and exactly applied. Dorothea Crane did not repeat her statement from outside the church after the Sunday service. She did not recant it either, but she did not repeat it. Vera went to see Ingrid Sorensen in the second week of January on a Tuesday when the Kansas sky was doing the thing it did in deep winter of being very cold and very clear. At the same time, the sun providing light with no heat, attached the air still enough that you could hear a wagon on the road half a mile away. She brought bread baked that morning because her mother had taught her that you did not visit the elderly empty-handed, not because they needed what you brought, but because the act of bringing it said something about the arrival that needed to be said. Ingrid's cabin was smaller and older than Vera's, the logs grayed with the exposure of 22 winters, the chinking redone in sections and patches over decades, a visible record of the maintenance that keeping a building sound in that climate required. The door was hung with a double curtain, the outer one made from heavy pieced wool faded at the edges by years of sun and weather. Vera stood at the door and looked at the curtain for a moment before she knocked, thinking about how long it had been there, how many winters it had covered this entrance, how many nights it had held still air in the passage against the cold, trying to get in. She knocked. Ingrid opened the door without the delay of someone who was not expecting a visitor. She looked at Vera and then at the bread, and she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Take the chair by the stove." Inside the cabin was warm in the way Vera's cabin was warm, now the deep and settled warmth of a room, where the heat belonged rather than merely visited. The walls were hung with fabric older and simpler than quilts, large pieces of heavy linen and wool that had long since faded to the colors of things put to serious continuous use over many years. The same 5-inch gap, the same straight, hang the same still air, doing its invisible work in the space between fabric and log. The stove burned low. Ingrid had been doing this for every winter she had been in Kansas. 22 winters. Vera sat in the offered chair. Ingrid poured coffee from a pot that had been on the stove long enough to become something substantial and dark, the kind of coffee that expressed a philosophy about mornings. Vera wrapped both hands around the cup. "How long have you known how to do this?" she said. "Since I was young," Ingrid said. "My mother taught me, her mother before her. In Sweden, the winters are long enough that you cannot afford ignorance of the practical things. This was one of the practical things. It was not a secret or a special knowledge. It was simply what everyone in the village knew, the way everyone knew how to put up food for winter or how to read the weather in the clouds." She held her own cup and looked toward the wall. "And in Kansas," Vera said. Ingrid was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet that contains something that has not yet found its words. "I tried to teach it," she said at last, 20 years ago, when I first came here and saw how the cabins were being built and how the families were burning through their wood trying to heat rooms that the walls were working against. I explained it to a family, the Brodericks, a young couple with children, good people, not unintelligent. I explained the principle and the method. I thought they understood." She paused. "They did not understand the part that mattered most. They hung blankets against the walls without maintaining the gap because that was how blankets had always been hung, and because I did not make certain they had truly understood the distance." Vera watched her. Their fire caught against the fabric before Christmas that year. Ingrid's voice was even and without drama. The house did not burn completely. The family got out. No one was seriously hurt, but they lost their belongings and spent 2 nights in the cold before neighbors could take them in. It was very frightening for everyone. She set down her cup. "The community said it was my fault. They said I had given the Brodericks bad advice, and the bad advice had led to the fire. They were not entirely wrong. My explanation had been insufficient. I had not made certain they understood the part without which the method becomes dangerous." She looked at her hands. "But I was ashamed and I was afraid of being blamed again, and so I stopped. I said nothing to anyone for 20 years. I watched families burn twice the wood they needed. I watched people suffer winters that the knowledge I carried could have made easier. And I said nothing because I was afraid." She looked at Vera directly. "You are not afraid in that way," she said. "I saw it when you came into the store. You came and you sat down and you listened. You were not afraid of being wrong. You were not afraid of what people would say. You were practical in the way that only people who have no room left for fear can be practical. That is a different thing from being brave. Brave is when you are afraid and you act anyway. You were not afraid. You simply could not afford it." Vera thought about this. "I had room for it," she said. "I just decided not to let it take up the space I needed." Ingrid looked at her for a moment and then made a sound that might have been a laugh, short and genuine, the laugh of a woman who had not had cause to laugh in a long time and was slightly surprised to find the capacity still present. They sat for another hour. The stove burned low and even. The still air did its work in the walls around them. Ingrid talked about Sweden, about the winters there, about the knowledge that accumulates in communities that have been living in the same cold for many generations each winter, teaching something to the people who survive it. Each lesson passed forward to the children who will face the next one. It was not invention, she said. It was accumulation. Small observations made by careful people over a long time, each one building on the last until the knowledge was so embedded in daily practice that no one remembered where it had begun. Like a man who puts a cabinet the wrong way against a wall and wonders why the corner stays warm, Vera said. Ingrid looked at her. Vera told her about Edmund's notebook, about the question written in October and underlined, about the northeast corner of the cabin with its 1-inch gap behind the warped cabinet. She told it plainly the way she told most things, without dramatizing what did not need dramatizing. Ingrid listened to all of it with complete attention. When Vera finished, she was quiet for a long moment. He was a careful man, she said. He was, Vera said. The careful ones always come close, Ingrid said. They see the evidence. They notice what is happening, and they ask why. They just sometimes need someone to give them the language for the answer. The knowledge does not care who names it. It only cares whether someone uses it. She looked at the faded linen on the wall, in the still air doing its invisible work in the gap behind it. You are using it, she said. That is what matters now. February came in hard. The kind of February that made October seem like a warning issued politely in advance, a formal notice before the real terms were delivered. The temperature dropped to levels that turned the air itself into something with edges, something that found the gaps between layers of clothing and made its presence felt there. The wind off the plains came without pause for most of the month, straight and relentless, the kind of wind that settles into everything and requires everything to prove itself against it, structures and plans and resolves alike. Vera's woodpile was still more than half full. She understood this number the way you understand a number that was supposed to be impossible. She had started November with half the wood she needed for a full Kansas winter. She should, by any reasonable calculation, have been in serious difficulty by January. By February, she should have been approaching crisis. Instead, she was burning wood at a rate that suggested she would finish the winter with a meaningful remainder. Not excess, not abundance, but enough. Enough to have come through it, and come through it with something left to show. She kept records every evening, noting the fire and the wood consumed, and the temperature and the state of the quilts, building a document that was no longer just personal accounting, but something larger, something that could be handed to the next person who needed it. On the morning of the 11th of February, she went out before breakfast to feed the chickens. The chickens lived in a small shed at the back of the cabin, insulated with straw and boarding, and they had come through the winter in reasonable condition, given what the winter had offered. She wore her wool dress and a light shawl, because the trip to the shed and back was 30 feet, and the morning was by February Kansas standards not exceptionally severe. She was scattering grain when she heard the sound of a wagon on the north road. She looked up. The minister's wagon was coming down the track, moving carefully in the rutted frozen ground, the horse picking its way with the deliberateness of an animal that had opinions about ice. At this distance, she could see that the figure on the wagon was wrapped in a volume of woolen blanket that made the driver nearly unidentifiable as a specific human being, a large and rounded shape that suggested the February cold had been taken with the utmost seriousness and prepared for accordingly. The wagon stopped at the edge of the yard. Dorothea Crane climbed down from it with the deliberate movements of someone encased in substantial insulation. She unwrapped enough of herself to be recognizable, and then she stood at the edge of the yard and looked across the 30 feet of frozen ground at Vera. Vera, who was standing in a light shawl with a bucket of grain in her hand feeding the chickens. Dorothea looked at the shawl. Then she looked at the cabin behind Vera. The ordinary exterior, 4 log walls and a plank door, the chimney putting out a thread of smoke that was pale and thin, the smoke of a fire burning very low. Not the heavy dark smoke of a stove working at full capacity to heat a room against a February morning. The modest exhale of a stove that was maintaining something rather than fighting to establish it. Vera said, "Good morning, Mrs. Crane." Dorothea said, "You're out feeding the chickens." "I am," Vera said. Dorothea looked again at the light shawl. At the wood pile stacked along the east wall of the cabin, still ranked and substantial, still more than half full in the second week of February. "The wood pile," Vera said pleasantly, "is still more than half full." Dorothea said nothing for a moment. The wind moved across the yard between them with its February indifference to the drama of the moment. Then Dorothea Crane said, "I would like to come inside." Vera scattered the last of the grain. "Come in then," she said, and she led the way across the frozen yard to the cabin door and held it open and let Dorothea Crane in all her woolen blanket step through it into the warmth that the cold had not been able to cross. The warmth hit Dorothea the moment she stepped through the inner curtain. She stopped moving entirely. She stood in the middle of Vera Hollis's cabin in all her layers and held very still the way a person holds still when something unexpected requires the body to catch up to the senses before the mind can process the information. The room was warm. Not warm in the way that a room is warm when a large fire has been burning hot all morning and the near surfaces are almost hot to the touch, and the far corners are still cold, and the wood is going fast. Warm in the way that a room is warm when the warmth is the room's own, when it has been held there through the night and through the morning and has had time to become the settled condition of the space rather than a temporary achievement of a working stove. The stove was burning low, barely crackling, making the sound of a fire that was not being pressed. A fire managing something already established, not creating something from cold. The coffee pot sat on the back plate. Vera lifted it and poured 2 cups and set one on the table and gestured at the chair beside it, and she sat in Edmund's chair across from it and waited. Dorothea sat. She unwound the scarf from her neck. She unbuttoned the top buttons of the coat. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She looked at the quilts on the walls at the grandmother's quilt, with its deep blue and cream pattern hanging still and straight on its rope, at the 5-inch pocket of open air between fabric and log, at the south wall panel drawn aside to let in the weak February light. She looked at the curtain she had just stepped through. She looked at the stove with its modest fire. She looked at all of it for a long time. Then she said, "How?" Just that one word, without its usual authority, without the surrounding framework of certainty that accompanied everything Dorothea Crane said in every other context. One word in a voice that had been reduced to its functional minimum by the fact of standing in a room that was warmer than her own house while looking at a stove that was burning less than a quarter of what her stoves burned. "The air between the quilts and the walls," Vera said. "It cannot move. Cold air moves and carries warmth away from the room, pulls it out through the walls. But air that has nowhere to go cannot carry anything. It simply holds its position. The quilts create a pocket of still air between themselves and the logs. The cold from the outside reaches that still air and stops. It cannot cross it. The warmth in the room stays in the room because there is no moving air to steal it." Dorothea looked at the north wall. "That is why the fabric doesn't touch the wall," she said. "If it touched the wall, it would conduct the cold directly into the room," Vera said. "The gap is everything. 5 inches measured and confirmed at every point. Without the gap, you have colored wood and nothing more." Dorothea held her cup and was quiet. You could see the arithmetic happening. You could see the numbers arranging themselves behind her eyes, the comparison forming between what she had always done and what she was sitting inside right now. "How much wood?" she said. 4 cords, Vera said. "Perhaps 4.5 to finish the winter." The silence that followed this number contained a great deal. Dorothea's household burned 9 cords. Her husband kept the church's wood consumption in the same ledger where he recorded everything pertaining to parish affairs, and the church burned 11. 20 cords between the house and the church, and the winter was not finished yet, and the church Dorothea now knew she would have to say it, the church was in trouble. She sat with the number 4.5 and let it mean what it meant. Then she straightened in the chair. She clasped her hands on the table with the precision that was her natural mode of expressing composure when composure was effortful. She looked at Vera directly. "The church is going to run out of wood," she said. She said it twice because the first time was a test of whether she was capable of saying it, and the second time was the actual saying. "The church is going to run out of wood before the end of February. Reverend Crane estimated we had sufficient stores for the season. He was incorrect. We have perhaps 3 weeks of wood remaining, and there is no budget for additional purchase before the March collections." She paused. "The congregation cannot worship in an unheated building. Services cannot be suspended." She looked at Vera. "We need a solution," she said. Vera looked back at her across the table, across the coffee cups, across the distance between a woman who had spent the autumn predicting disaster and a woman who had spent the autumn preventing it. She understood what this moment had cost. Not the asking, they had not arrived at the asking yet. The approaching, the unwinding of certainty, the long walk from the wagon to the door, The stepping through a curtain into a room she had publicly predicted would be cold, and finding it warm, the sitting down in the chair of a woman she had tried to redirect toward a different life, and then looking that woman in the eye and beginning to speak about a problem that required the kind of help she had spent months suggesting was unnecessary. Dorothea Crane had said repeatedly and with conviction that Vera Hollis would not survive the winter on her own terms. She had said this with the sincerity of a woman who had never been seriously wrong about what the prairie required of women in Vera's situation. She had said it in the grammar of concern, which was the grammar she used for everything she wanted to be true, as well as everything she believed was true, and sometimes she could not tell the difference between the two. She had been wrong. She was sitting inside the evidence of her wrongness, drinking its coffee warm in its February room, and she was beginning to ask for help. Vera said, "What does the church need?" Dorothea said, "Whatever you can teach us." They went on a Thursday. Vera and Ingrid Sorensen walking together through the February morning to the church at the center of the settlement. Ingrid, with her walking stick and her basket and her silver braids pinned under a wool hat. Vera with Edmund's notebook under her arm and a coil of rope over her shoulder and a sack of wooden pegs that knocked together with a small rhythmic percussion at every step. The sky above them was the particular blue of winter mornings in Kansas, a blue so clear and cold it seemed to exist separately from everything beneath it, indifferent to the human business being conducted on the ground below. Ingrid had not been inside the church in 11 years. She did not say this aloud. She said it to herself in Swedish on the walk in the way of a person marking the occasion for the internal record without making a performance of it. 11 years since the last time she had sat in the front pew at Reverend Crane's invitation and spoken about Uppsala and the journey and the first winter on the claim, and the congregation had listened with the strained attention of people hearing a foreign language through thick glass, understanding the shape of what was being said without the content. Afterward, 3 people had spoken to her. The rest had drifted away with the careful choreography of people who have somewhere else to be and have decided this is the moment to be there. She had not gone back after that. She went back now because Vera had asked, and because 20 years of silence had allowed knowledge to sit unused that other people had paid for in wood and cold, and because she was 81 years old and had decided that 81 was old enough to have finished being afraid of the wrong things. The church was cold. It was the particular cold of a large room designed for assembly rather than habitation, with a high ceiling that collected the heat produced by the stove and held it 10 feet above the heads of the people who needed it, and walls with gaps in the planking where the boards had shrunk through the dry autumn and not been adequately sealed before winter arrived. The stove at the front of the room was burning with determined effort, producing heat as fast as it could manage, losing the competition to the walls and the ceiling, and the floor draft that moved along the ground from the north side to the east in a continuous cold current. Reverend Crane was there, and 6 men from the congregation whom Dorothea had assembled, with the quiet authority she exercised in all organizational matters. They stood near the stove in their coats and watched the 2 women come through the door, and the quality of their watching was different from what it would have been in November. Not the watching of people waiting to be confirmed in a judgment already rendered. Something quieter than that. Something that in a more demonstrative community among men who expressed more of what they felt might have been called the beginning of humility. Vera set the rope and the pegs on the front pew. She walked the perimeter of the room the way Edmund had walked a building site when they were first establishing the claim, slowly, one hand on the wall, attention distributed between what she could see and what she could feel. She moved along the north wall and found 4 significant gaps in the log chinking. She found the west wall in worse condition, 2 boards that had pulled entirely from their framing at the base, a draft that entered there and moved along the floor with enough force to be felt from 3 feet away. She found a problem at the base of the chimney where the flashing had separated from the log and left an opening at the width of 2 fingers that was admitting cold air directly beside the one heat source the room possessed. She found 2 sections of roofing where the insulating layer between planks and shingles had never been adequately installed. 14 significant problems in a building that had been housing the community's spiritual life through Kansas winters for 8 years. Ingrid walked the perimeter behind her, one hand on the wall, her stick tapping occasionally against a spot where the surface told her something useful. She confirmed what Vera found and occasionally indicated something Vera had not yet reached, pointing with the stick. Without comment, her pale eyes moving from the wall to Vera's face to confirm the discovery had registered. They worked the room together without speaking much, and the men near the stove watched them work and the stove burned its determined fire, and the heat went where heat always went in that room, which was mostly out. Vera came back to the front. She said, "The gaps first. Everything's sealed before we hang anything because the fabric will not compensate for open holes in the walls." She held up the pegs. "Then we hang." She looked at Reverend Crane. "The wool stored in the back room from the harvest festival. I saw it when we came in. Is it available?" Reverend Crane said that it was, and that whatever was needed could be used. 5 inches from every wall, Vera said. Not 4, not 6. 5 exactly. She held up the doweling rod cut to that measurement, the same rod she had carried in her coat pocket since November, the rod she had used to check every quilt in her own cabin and every curtain in the Morrison cabin. If you hang the fabric flush against the wall, it will conduct the cold directly into the room. Without the gap, the fabric is only a decoration. The distance is the mechanism. Without it, you have nothing. She looked at the men. No one laughed. No one moved toward the door or exchanged the sideways glance of men who have decided they are not going to take something seriously. Gareth Morrison was standing at the back of the group, and he nodded once, the nod of a man who had seen a thing work in his own home and had no further questions about whether it was worth attempting. They spent 4 hours in the church. The men sealed the gaps with moss and clay and canvas strips from the storage room. Reverend Crane himself climbed to the roof to address the chimney flashing, which Vera suspected had been on the list of things to get to eventually for longer than this winter. Ingrid directed the placement of draft barriers at the floor level on the north and west sides, showing 2 of the younger men how to roll the canvas tightly enough to form a continuous seal rather than a series of inadequate patches. Vera hung the wool. She worked with 2 of the men who had carpentry skills and patience, and she checked the spacing herself at every stage, running the doweling rod behind each section, adjusting where the hang was wrong or the spacing had drifted. She explained what she was looking for and why as she went, not because she had planned to teach while she worked, but because the explaining was the work, the part that made what she was building transferable rather than singular, the part that ensured that when she left, the knowledge stayed. By afternoon, the wool was up on every wall but the south where the tall windows were, and those windows she addressed with panels that could be tied back during services and released afterward, preserving both the insulation during the long empty hours and the light during the hours when people needed it. At the door, she hung a double curtain explaining the passage to Reverend Crane as she worked the cold air and how to interrupt its journey before it reached the main room. He listened with the focused attention of a man who has recently discovered that there are categories of practical knowledge he had not previously considered relevant to his calling and is revising this position. When the last panel was in place, they built the stove fire back to a moderate level and stood in the church and waited. Within an hour, the room was warmer than it had been all winter, with the stove burning at its maximum. Reverend Crane stood near the front pew and looked at the wool panels hanging 5 inches from the walls, and at the stove burning at a fraction of its usual effort, and at the room that was holding heat in a way it had never managed before in 8 years of winter services. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Mrs. Hollis, I owe you more than an apology for what was said about you this winter." Vera said, "You owe me nothing, Reverend. The woodpile is what matters now." He turned from the wall and looked at Ingrid, who was sitting in the front pew with her walking stick across her lap, her hat still on her silver braids framing the face of a woman who had waited 11 years since her last time in this building, and rather longer than that for a room to feel like this one did now. "I owe Mrs. Sorensen an apology," he said. "Long overdue and given now without qualification." Ingrid looked at him with the steady gray eyes that had been watching the settlement from its margins for 22 years. "You should have listened," she said. "But here we are." She said it without bitterness. That was the thing about it that would stay with Vera long after. 20 years of being right about something that could have helped people, and 20 years of silence enforced by blame, and not a trace of bitterness in the 3 words she said when the apology finally came. Only the plain statement of fact that things could have been different, and the equally plain statement of fact that they had arrived where they had arrived, and that here was where the work needed to happen. Dorothea Crane stood at the back of the room throughout all of it. She did not help with the pegs. She did not hand up the wool panels or hold the rope while the spacing was checked. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, and she watched 2 women that this settlement had spent considerable energy ignoring stand at the front of the room and teach the room something it had been needing to know. She never said afterward that she had been wrong. Not that day, not in the weeks and months that followed. She did not acknowledge that she had spent the autumn predicting an outcome that had not occurred, or that she had encouraged others to predict the same thing, or that the woman she had tried to redirect toward remarriage had spent the winter demonstrating that the redirection had been unnecessary. But she stopped saying Vera needed a husband. She stopped predicting disaster. She stopped visiting the Hollis cabin with her basket and her concern and her list of men in other counties who might be interested. And when the settlement women talked in the spring about the Hollis method, about the dead air principle, about the family that had come through February on 4 cords of wood, Dorothea Crane did not correct the name or offer a different version of events. That was for a woman of her particular constitution and long-established certainty as close to an apology as the situation was going to produce. Vera recognized it as such and accepted it on those terms because she was a practical woman, and practical women take what is available rather than insisting on what is ideal. The spring came the way Kansas springs came, without ceremony. The cold withdrawing by degrees, the mornings warming in increments so small you could only perceive them by comparison across a week rather than a day. The mud returned. The grass began its annual reassertion across the prairie floor. The cottonwood on the rise east of the cabin put out its first tentative leaves in a green so pale it was almost yellow, the color of beginnings. 6 families had hung quilts before the winter was fully out. They had come to Vera directly, not through the settlement's informal channels or the softened versions that circulated at the general store, but directly standing at her door with the clear intention of learning something and the equally clear intention of doing it correctly. She showed each family the same thing she had shown the Morrisons in the church: the pegs, the rope, the precise distance, the dowling rod that confirmed what eyes alone could approximate but not verify, the sealed doorframe, the inner curtain, the draft barrier at the floor. She showed each of them how to identify which wall needed the heaviest fabric and why, how to check the hanging after a week for any settling that might close the gap, how to correct the spacing if it shifted. And she showed them Edmund's notebook. Not all of it, only the page with the question. The page where his careful hand had written in the October of 1883, "East corner stays warm, why?" and had underlined the question with the pencil that still sat in the notebook's spine, lodged there as if placed for preservation. She showed them the question because the question was the beginning of everything. Edmund had seen the evidence in his own cabin and had written it down. He had not lived to hear the answer, but the act of seeing and the act of writing it down were the acts of a man who understood that knowledge required attention and record, who understood that what you noticed but did not record was knowledge that stopped with you. By the following autumn, 12 more families had hung their walls. By the winter of 1887, half the settlement was doing it. The demand for heavy batting and fabric drove prices up at the general store in Toller Creek, and the merchant Abbott wrote to his Wichita supplier for 3 times his usual order, describing in his letter in the baffled but interested terms of a practical businessman what the community was doing and why it was doing it, and what the impact on his inventory had been. The principal traveled in that letter further east than Toller Creek had previously managed to send anything. People called it different things in different places: the Hollis method, the quilt wall, the Swedish insulation, dead air spacing. The names varied, and the understanding was sometimes complete, and sometimes partial, and sometimes somewhere between the two. But the principle itself was stable across all of them, the way a true principle is stable, consistent, regardless of who names it or what story gets attached to it. One afternoon in the spring of 1887, a young man came to Vera's door from the county seat. He was perhaps 25, with the manner of someone conducting official work who is uncertain of his reception. He introduced himself as working for the County Historical Society, compiling a record of agricultural and domestic innovations in the county and the surrounding area. And he said he had been directed to her by several people who agreed that the insulation method now widely used in the settlement had originated here. She invited him in. She showed him the cabin. He took notes in a ledger, small and precise, the notes of someone trained to record accurately rather than impressionistically. She explained the method as she always explained it, starting from the physics and moving outward to the application, the dead air principle first, and then the specifics of spacing and material and orientation, because the why mattered as much as the how, and more than either, in terms of whether the person who received the information could pass it on correctly to the next person who needed it. He asked where she had learned it. She said, from a woman named Ingrid Sorensen. She came to Kansas from Uppsala, Sweden in 1862. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers. The method has existed in cold country communities for as long as people in those places have been trying to stay warm, which is a very long time. It is not an invention, it is an accumulation. He wrote this down, then she said, "I would like to show you something else." She took Edmund's notebook from the shelf above the fireplace and set it open on the table in front of him. East corner stays warm, why? The question and its two underlines. He read it. He read it again more slowly. He looked up at her. "My husband observed the dead air effect in his own cabin before either of us had a name for it," she said. He noticed the warmth in the corner where the cabinet sat 1 inch from the wall. He wrote the question down in October of 1883. He did not live to hear the answer. She looked at the notebook on the table. "I want his name in the record beside mine. And I want Ingrid Sorensen's name beside both of ours because without her, the question would still be a question." The young man from the Historical Society looked at the page in the notebook for a long moment. He said, "The observation itself is significant. Noticing the phenomenon and asking why, that is the first act of any understanding. Without the question, the answer has nowhere to land." Vera said, "That is exactly what he would have said." The young man copied the text of the question into his ledger word for word, underlines and all. "Edmund Hollis," he wrote, "October 1883. East corner stays warm, why?" Below it, answered by Ingrid Sorensen of Uppsala, Sweden, and applied by Vera Hollis, Holt County, Kansas. Winter of 1884 to 1885. He closed the ledger. He said, "I'll see that this is properly recorded and attributed." He was as good as his word. Ingrid Sorensen died in the spring of 1888. She went the way she had lived, which was to say, without drama, without fuss, without any particular performance of the event. She was 82 years old and had lived through 63 winters between those she had known in Sweden and those she had faced on the Kansas prairie, and 63 winters was by any reasonable accounting a record that commanded respect. She had been unwell since March, a heaviness in her chest that settled in and declined to leave. She described it to Vera in February with the dispassion of a woman diagnosing a problem in a building she had been maintaining for a long time and had decided was reaching the end of what maintenance could accomplish. "Not serious in the way that crises are serious," she said. "Just old. The body decides at some point that it has done what it came to do. Mine is deciding." Vera came every other day through March and into April. She brought bread, which she continued to bring because she had been raised to bring something when you visited and had not found a reason to change this practice. She brought whatever news there was from the settlement, the small accumulation of human events that constituted the life of a community in that season. She sat in the chair by the stove and talked, and Ingrid listened, and sometimes Ingrid talked and Vera listened, and sometimes they sat in the warmth that the dead air held, and neither of them said anything at all, which was also a kind of conversation, the kind that requires the most trust. In the first week of April, on an afternoon when the light through the south window had the particular quality of late winter giving way to early spring, Ingrid asked her to take down one of the wall hangings. Vera said, "Which one?" "The east wall," Ingrid said. "The linen one. I want to see the logs." Vera took it down, unhooking the fabric from its rope and folding it carefully, the way the fabric had been handled in this cabin for 22 years, with the respect owed to things that have done important work for a long time. The log behind it was dry and pale, the same color as the day it had been laid undamaged by moisture, unmarked by the freeze-thaw cycling that damaged unprotected wood over decades of exposure. 22 winters of still air between fabric and log had preserved the surface as well as anything could have preserved it. Ingrid looked at it for a while. "My husband and I laid those logs in June of 1862, she said. "He was not a carpenter. He was a farmer from a family of farmers, and he built this cabin the way farmers build things, which is squarely and with attention to what the structure is required to do without much interest in elegance. He was proud of it." She looked at the log and its pale, undamaged surface. "He died that 1st January. Vera sat on the edge of the bed and did not speak. "The cold was worse than we expected," Ingrid said. "We had come from a cold country. We thought we knew cold. But a Kansas winter in an unfinished cabin with not enough wood and a man who was not well to begin with." She paused. "I had the fabric on the walls. I knew how to do it. But it was not enough that first winter because we had not prepared properly for what we were facing, and because he was already weakened before the worst of it came." She was quiet for a moment. "I have lived in this cabin for 26 years since then," she said. "I stayed because the land was ours, and because there was nowhere else I had a better claim to. And then after a while, because this is where he built those logs into walls, and I did not want to leave them. She looked at the bare log on the east wall. They are square. He was always careful about square. Vera said nothing. Ingrid said, "You will stay on your land." It was not a question. Vera said, "I will stay." "Good," Ingrid said. "The land needs people who understand what it requires, not people who fight it, people who learn it, who pay attention to it, who write down what they notice and ask why." She closed her eyes. Vera sat with her through the afternoon and through the evening, and Ingrid Sorensen died in the night of the 14th of April, 1888 in the cabin her husband had built squarely in the summer of 1862, in a room that was warm because the air behind the walls did not move. Vera had asked her in one of the February visits where she wanted to be buried, and Ingrid had been specific. On the rise behind the cabin near the cottonwood that grew along the creek where it bent east. Not in the settlement churchyard. On her own land, under a tree she had watched through every window of every season of 26 years. Vera saw to it. She dug the grave herself, which was harder work than she had anticipated and took longer than she had planned, and she was grateful for the difficulty of it, for the way it gave her hands something to do, while the rest of her held what it was holding. She dug it square and level, the way Edmund would have dug it, the way Ingrid's husband would have understood it needed to be. She stood at the finished grave under the cottonwood with the April wind moving through the new grass around her feet and the settlement spread out below in the distance, its small structures and its smoke and its ordinary continuous life. And she said aloud what she had been saying in her head since the night of the 14th. "You did good," she said. She said it to the woman in the ground and also to the air, to the still air trapped behind the walls of the cabin behind her, to the principal that had traveled from a cold country across an ocean and across a continent and had arrived in a general store in Taller Creek in October of 1884, precisely when someone with half a woodpile and a dead husband's question had needed it. You did good. The summer of 1888 was dry, which was not unusual, and Vera worked the claim through it with the combination of attention and stubbornness that the land had required of her from the beginning and had received. She added the improvements the homestead law required and maintained what Edmund had built, and built what he had not gotten to working from his notebook, from the list of things he had intended, and not reached completing the record of his unfinished sentences, one board and one stone, and one sealed gap at a time. She was not lonely in the way she had been lonely in the autumn of 1884. That loneliness had been the specific shape of a life designed for two, suddenly reduced to one, the grief of inhabiting a space built with another person as part of its architecture. This was different, a life that had found its own form, a shape that was entirely hers. She was not looking for a husband. She was not opposed to one. She had thought about it in the practical terms she applied to most decisions and had concluded that the question deserved to remain open rather than be answered in advance. An answer given in advance of the evidence was a judgment masquerading as a conclusion, and she had learned the hard way what judgments made in advance of evidence cost. Silas Pruitt came in September of 1888. He came the way several people had come in the year since the knowledge had spread further than the settlement, which was on horseback at a reasonable hour with a clear and direct statement of purpose. He said he had heard about the insulation method and had come to understand it correctly before attempting it in his own cabin 2 counties south, which had, he said, the same northern wall problem that every cabin on the plains had to some degree, and which he had been burning excessive wood against for 3 winters without satisfying resolution. He was 41 years old, with the weathered look of a man who had spent those years working primarily outdoors and had reached an accommodation with what that required. He was not a man who talked more than the situation needed. He asked precise questions and listened to the complete answer before asking the next one, and he looked at the walls with the attention of someone intending to replicate what he was seeing rather than simply admire it. He ran the dowling rod behind the quilts himself to verify the 5-inch gap, not because he doubted it, but because verification was how a careful man worked. When he had seen all of it, he stood in the middle of the room and held Edmund's notebook in both hands. He read the question. He read it again. He said he was close. Vera said he was. Silas said, "A man who writes down what he notices is a man who trusts the evidence over the assumption." He looked at the underline. "That's rarer than it ought to be." He handed the notebook back to her. He said, "Your husband sounds like he was a careful man." "He was," Vera said. Silas Pruitt stayed for 3 days. On the second day, he noticed that the storage shed behind the cabin had a roof section that needed attention before the next rain and asked if she had the materials for it. She did. He fixed it without making the offer into a statement about her need for assistance, which she appreciated. And then the next morning, he fixed the gap at the base of the west wall that she had been intending to address since February. And she let him because the gap needed addressing, and he had the skills, and there was no reason to refuse useful work performed by someone who was not making a point about it. He came back in October. He came back in November with the first cold to report that his cabin was holding warmth at a rate he found genuinely difficult to account for by any other means, and he stayed 2 days and helped Vera bank the south side of the cabin with sod against the winter wind and left again. He came back in December and in January, and each time the visit was a little longer and the work was a little more integrated with what she was already doing. And she found that this was not a thing she needed to resist or examine too closely, that it was simply a situation developing in the direction it was developing, and the direction seemed reasonable. He came back at Christmas and stayed through New Year's. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday in February of 1889, standing in her cabin where the quilts hung on their ropes and the fire burned low and the coffee was warm on the back of the stove. And outside, the February wind was doing what February wind did, which was everything it could. He asked it the way he did most things, directly, and without preparation of the ground, with a clear statement of what he meant and why he meant it. She said yes. Not because she needed someone to cut the wood or manage the winter or prove the claim. She had managed the winter. She had proved the claim. She had demonstrated over the course of a winter that the community had expected to finish her, that she was capable of everything the land in the season required, and a number of things beyond that. She said yes because he was a man who held a dead man's notebook in both hands and said that trusting the evidence over the assumption was rarer than it ought to be, and because he had come back in October and November and December, not because he was needed, but because he wanted to be there, and had been useful in the way that people are useful when they are genuinely present rather than performing presence. And she found that she did not want him to stop coming back. They married in March of 1889. He brought his own quilts to the cabin. They were substantial quilts, well-made thick, batting the quilts of a man who had always lived in cold places and had always understood that preparation was not pessimism, but respect for the facts. Vera hung them on the east wall, which had been wanting a heavier layer since the previous winter. They fit as if they had been made for the space. She took this as an adequate sign. They raised 5 children in the cabin on the Hollis Pruitt claim, and every one of those children grew up knowing what dead air was before they knew what a schoolroom was, because the principle was part of the house, in the way the stove was part of the house, in the way the plank floor and the patch chinking and the cottonwood on the rise east of the claim were part of the house, simply present, simply true, simply the way things were and had always been in their particular experience of the world. They grew up knowing why the northeast corner was always the warmest corner, because Vera told each of them the story of the cabinet with the warped leg and the man who noticed the warmth and wrote down the question. They understood that the warmth they lived in was the answer to a question asked by someone who had not lived to hear it, which was a particular kind of inheritance that had no monetary value and could not be divided or sold or appraised, but was as real as the logs in the walls and considerably more durable. The cabin stood on the Hollis Pruitt claim until 1923, when Vera and Silas built a proper frame house on the same site, the cabin by then 39 years old, and having served its purpose with a thoroughness that entitled it to retirement. The new house had manufactured insulation in its walls, factory-made batting, and finished board, the product of a building industry that had spent several decades arriving through various routes and rediscoveries at principles that a widow in Kansas had worked out with wooden pegs and quilts in the autumn of 1884. Silas took down the old cabin himself, with 2 of their sons disassembling the logs in the reverse of the order they had been laid, working from the roof down. When they reached the northeast corner of the north wall, the logs there were in better condition than any other section of the structure, better preserved than the south wall, which had the window, better preserved than the west wall, which faced the prevailing wind, better preserved than any log that had been exposed to the full cycle of Kansas weather across 4 decades. The dead air that had stood in that corner, first by the accident of a warped cabinet, and then by the deliberate design of a woman who understood what the accident had demonstrated, had protected the wood from moisture and temperature cycling for 39 years. The logs in that corner looked almost as they had the day Edmund laid them. The oldest son picked up Edmund's notebook from the crate where Vera had brought it out to the worksite that day, and he opened it to the page she had marked for him. He read aloud, "East corner stays warm. Why?" Vera looked at him. "Why?" he said. He already knew the answer. He had always known the answer. But he asked it the way his grandfather had asked it, as a statement of method, as a declaration that questions mattered, and that the act of asking was itself a kind of work. "Because the air stops," Vera said. "Because air that cannot move cannot carry the cold to you. Because your grandfather put a cabinet 1 inch from the wall, and the wrong thing was the right idea, and he almost knew it." She looked at the corner of the dismantled cabin, where the logs stood clean and sound in the spring light. "He was so close," she said. "The quilts were not retired when the new house was built." Vera hung them in the new rooms in the same configuration she had established in November of 1884, because the principle was the principle, regardless of whether the walls behind the fabric were logs or modern frame construction, and because the quilts were the quilts, each one with its particular history and its particular weight, and the particular wall it had been assigned to by a woman in a cold autumn, calculating how to get through a winter on resources that should not have been adequate. The grandmother's quilt, the double wedding ring in deep blue and cream, the one Vera had hung on the north wall in the first week of November of 1884, was the last one she carried into the new house. She hung it on the north wall, where it had always been. Vera Hollis Pruitt died in 1927, 43 years after the winter the community had expected to finish her. She was 72 years old. She had outlasted the cabin and the claim requirements, and 2 of her 5 children's serious childhood illnesses, and 1 drought that had required from her the same combination of practical attention and refusal to panic that she had first assembled in the autumn of 1884. She had outlasted the settlement as it had been in that year, which had grown into a town with a main street and a bank and a school with 2 rooms and a hardware store run by Gareth Morrison's oldest son, and she had watched it grow and had contributed to its growing in the various ways that a woman of her particular dispositions contributed to things, which was mostly by doing the work and making the knowledge available to whoever wanted it. She donated the double wedding ring quilt to the County Historical Society before she died. She wrote a letter to accompany it in the same careful hand that had maintained the cabin records and the wood consumption logs and the technical notebook for 4 decades, explaining what the quilt was and what it had done and where the understanding had come from. And she asked specifically that the letter be preserved with the quilt, and that the display, if there was to be one, include all 3 of the names to whom the story actually belonged. The Historical Society did as she asked. The quilt was mounted in a glass case in the room dedicated to the county's settlement history, a room that contained the ledgers and the tools and the photographs and the documents of the people who had come to that land in the decades after the war and had stayed on it long enough to make something out of it. The quilt was among the oldest objects in the collection, and among the best preserved, the batting still thick, and even after 43 years, the blue and cream of the pattern still clear. Beside it, they placed a card. It read, "The Hollis Quilt, November 1884, double wedding ring pattern, hand-stitched by Martha Hollis of Defiance County, Ohio, circa 1841. Donated by Vera Hollis Pruitt, 1927. Below that, in the same type, used by Vera Hollis during the winter of 1884 to 1885 to demonstrate the dead air insulation principle. Fabric hung 5 inches from interior wall surfaces, traps still air that cannot conduct heat away from the room. Applied to a cabin running on half its expected firewood supply, the method allowed a single woman to survive a full Kansas winter and retain more than half her wood stores by February. The technique spread through the settlement and into surrounding counties, changing how families in the region manage winter heat. And below that, in a final line that Vera had written into her letter with deliberate and underlined emphasis, because she had known that final lines were where things got abbreviated, if no one insisted otherwise. Dead air principle introduced to Kansas by Ingrid Sorensen. Uppsala, Sweden arrived 1862. Observed independently by Edmund Hollis, Holt County, October 1883. Applied and taught by Vera Hollis Winter, 1884 to 1885. 3 names on a card in a glass case. Vera had written all 3 into her letter with the same care she had given to every measurement she had ever taken with the dowling rod, every peg she had driven into the north wall in that first November, every quilt she had hung at the exact distance that made the difference between something that worked and something that almost worked. Because the distance between getting a thing right and getting it almost right was always small, and it always mattered. And because these three people deserved to be placed correctly in the record with the precision their contributions had earned. Edmund had noticed the warmth and asked why. Ingrid had carried the answer for 60 years in the silence that blame had enforced. Vera had been the one who needed both of them in the same winter, in the same Kansas cold, and had understood what she was being given, and had used it, and had then spent the next 40 years making sure that other people could find it when they needed it too. Three names, one principle. The quilt hung in its case deep blue and cream. The double wedding ring pattern still bright after more than 4 decades, the batting still thick in the way of things made to last by people who expected to need them for a long time. The still air of the museum room around it was not the same as the still air that had held warmth in a log cabin in the winter of 1884. But it was air that did not move, and in that way it was the same principle, the same patient fact, the same truth that cold had been unable to argue with then and could not argue with now. Still air, still after everything, still air. The cold had pressed against the north wall on the morning of the 7th of November, 1884, and had found something in its way that it could not cross. It had never crossed it.